In the fall of 2009, every combined repair counter in Jackson County, Missouri, was telling the same story about bearings. The story sounded different depending on where you heard it. At the dealership it sounded like part numbers, rush freight, and the official assumption that worn bearings had no afterlife. At the machine shop it sounded like tolerance loss, heat scars, race damage, and the sort of technical language that makes scrap feel scientific. At the co-op it sounded like common sense. A worn bearing was a dead bearing. Once it had squealed, loosened, seized, spun, or started leaving gray powder in a housing, you replaced it and threw the old one away. You did not save them. You did not stack them in bins. You did not study them. Modern agriculture had moved too far, too fast, and too expensively for that kind of thrift. Or so the county thought. The man who disagreed was named Dale Cormick. Dale was 63 in 2009, though age on him looked less like a number than a series of specific repairs. His shoulders had settled. 2 fingers on his left hand never straightened fully after a press accident in 1987. His hearing in one ear had been shortened by years of running grinders without enough caution. But his eyes remained sharp, especially around metal. He operated a small repair shop outside Oak Grove with his son-in-law part-time and his own stubbornness full-time. The sign out front still said Cormick Welding and Repair, though welding had long ago become only part of what happened there. Farmers brought him augers, broken feeder house shafts, bent reel supports, snapped planter arms, cracked castings, seized hubs, and the kind of machinery problems official systems dislike because they require thought instead of inventory. Over the course of 12 years, farmers also brought him worn bearings. Not because they respected the habit. Mostly because Dale asked for them. If a customer came in with a failed bearing, Dale would say, "Leave the old one." If a dealership service hand he knew replaced a set on a corn head, Dale would say, "Dump the dead ones in my tote instead of the dumpster." If a neighbor cleaned out a machine shed and found coffee cans full of used bearings with faded part numbers, Dale would buy the whole lot for nearly nothing, then spend winter evenings cleaning, sorting, and tagging them. The county found this mildly ridiculous. Even people who respected Dale's shop work tended to treat the bearing bins as evidence of a man unable to let go of the past. His son-in-law, Aaron Pike, called it the graveyard wall. Along one side of the shop, steel shelving held crate after crate of bearings, flanged units, insert bearings, double-row assemblies, tapered roller sets, oddball metric conversions, sealed agricultural housings, plain industrial radial bearings, and dozens of partials that looked useless to anyone who had not spent time learning what still mattered after failure. Dale did not simply save them. He documented them. Original markings, shield type, race dimensions, housing fit, known applications, salvageability, cross-reference guesses. If a bearing had failed because grease was neglected but the cones and cups remained honest, he marked it one way. If the outer race was ruined but the insert geometry still taught him something valuable, another way. Truly dead pieces he kept anyway if their dimensions filled a hole in his mental catalog. To Dale, even failed bearings were information. The county laughed because the county had grown accustomed to replacement as a first language. A young service manager at the Independence dealership once said Dale was collecting rust and excuses. A large operator named Curtis Hall joked at coffee that if every old machine part deserved a second life, Dale would eventually open a hospital for washers. Even Aaron, who worked beside him and loved him, sometimes asked what exactly the plan was supposed to be. "You can't rebuild a sealed bearing back to factory new," Aaron said one night while closing the shop. Dale nodded. "Didn't say I could." "Then why keep a wall of dead ones?" Dale wiped grease from a housing bore he'd been measuring and answered in the tone he used when a question was simple enough to deserve seriousness. "Because worn isn't dead in all the same ways." That was classic Dale. Half instruction, half refusal to simplify. What he meant was that a bearing failure contains layers. Sometimes the race is destroyed but the housing fit information matters. Sometimes one assembly holds a cup or cone geometry that can be paired with another to create a usable substitute. Sometimes the insert is gone but the collar, flange, locking eccentric, or snap ring arrangement is exactly what a farmer will not be able to buy in a hurry 5 years from now. Sometimes the bearing itself cannot be saved, but the fact of its dimensions can save a machine when every official catalog insists no substitute exists. Dale collected worn bearings because he distrusted helplessness that came in part number format. He learned that distrust honestly. In the 1980s he ran custom harvesting for a few years and discovered, the hard way, how many breakdowns happen outside business hours in counties too far from distribution centers to matter quickly. He learned what it meant to have a machine idled not by major destruction but by a component the size of a coffee mug. He learned that a farmer can fabricate a bracket, weld a crack, straighten a shaft, shim a housing, and improvise a mount, but if the bearing at the center of the whole arrangement is unavailable, the machine is still just expensive scenery. Over time he developed a private rule. Anything that rotates under harvest load deserves respect. Anything that rotates under harvest load and becomes hard to source deserves memory. By 2021, the wall of bearings had become local folklore. Kids helping in harvest shops had heard about it. Dealership parts men joked about it. Aaron used it to scare apprentices into keeping the shop organized. "Put that somewhere stupid and Dale will know," he'd say. "He's got dead bearings older than your marriage with better labels." Dale himself never defended the wall in public. He did not need to. He was content to let people laugh as long as they kept dropping off old failures instead of throwing them away. When a combine owner changed feeder house bearings, Dale wanted the takeoffs. When a grain cart went down on hub units, he wanted the scorched housings too. When an old corn head got stripped for scrap, he wanted the gathering chain idlers, the hex bores, the eccentric collars, the dust shields, the whole unhappy family of rotational evidence. The year everything changed began with a fire nobody in Jackson County paid much attention to. It happened at an industrial bearing plant in another state, then layered on top of a shipping backlog that was already quietly tightening agricultural inventories. Dealers kept smiling. Distributors kept promising. Most operators never knew how thin the pipeline had become because modern logistics are designed to hide their own fragility until the moment hiding is no longer possible. By July of 2021, some oddball sizes were taking longer. By August, a few enclosed agricultural units were backordered in ways that made service managers uncomfortable. Still, harvest hadn't started in full, and no one in the county yet felt urgency. Farmers are very good at disbelieving shortages until the shortage touches something with their own acreage attached to it. Then corn started black layering early. Not everywhere, but enough. Dry August weather pushed maturity. Milo came on. Soybeans moved faster than people expected. Suddenly everybody needed the same kinds of parts at once, and harvest season has a way of exposing every weak assumption in a distribution network. The first real alarm came when a large operator south of Grain Valley lost 2-cylinder support bearings on an older combine and was told by the dealer that one size could not be sourced for at least 8 days. 8 days in harvest is not a delay. It is a moral injury. The operator swore the parts man was confused. The parts man checked again. Same answer. 2 days later a grain cart hub bearing failed on the Hall operation. Curtis Hall, the same man who once joked about Dale's washer hospital, assumed he'd be running again by afternoon. The dealership had sold him plenty of confidence over the years. Instead the parts counter told him the exact unit he needed was on indefinite backorder. They could maybe locate one in Minnesota. Maybe. No guarantee. The part number cross-reference turned up multiple listings, all with ghost inventory. His cart sat half-loaded in the edge of a field while trucks waited, and Curtis finally did what pride only permits after every official route has embarrassed it. He called Dale. Dale was in the shop sorting a batch of combine clean grain elevator bearings someone had dropped off the week before. He listened without comment while Curtis explained the failure, then asked for the old unit, the housing, and 5 minutes without interruption once he had them. Curtis arrived with both. Dale measured the shaft, measured the bore, studied the locking arrangement, and walked to the wall. Aaron watched him stop at 3 crates in sequence, then at a shelf of tagged industrial inserts, then at a milk crate full of collars and seals. After 20 minutes he came back carrying an insert bearing from a different application, a collar from a cornhead shaft assembly, and 2 shims cut from a pile of salvaged housing sleeves he had made years earlier because some fool would need them one day. Curtis looked at the pieces and said, "That's not the right bearing." Dale answered, "It's the right dimensions and the wrong label." "That enough for you?" They fitted it. The insert needed 1 grease passage modified and the collar orientation reversed from factory standard. Dale machined a tiny relief on the bench lathe, seated the unit, checked spin, handed it back, and said, "Run it. Watch heat every load. Bring it back when harvest's done." Curtis ran it. It finished corn and beans. Word moved before the weekend. The county had always known Dale saved worn bearings. Now it discovered he had also saved options. Once one impossible repair became known, the phone started. Feeder house idlers. Tailings auger support bearings. Grain platform wobblebox units. Unloading auger carrier assemblies. Reel bearings on older draper heads. Elevator shaft supports. Corn head snapping roll units. Cart hubs. Conveyor tail rollers. Dryer fans. Anything that turned and suddenly could not be bought became a candidate for Dale's wall. Now, it is important to say that Dale did not wave a magic wand over destroyed metal and make it new. He did something more useful. He separated the truly dead from the apparently dead. He cross-matched dimensions across applications. He harvested good components out of partially failed sets. He paired surviving cups from one assembly with acceptable cones from another when load and fit allowed it. He repacked units the factory never intended to be repacked. He machined sleeves to adapt industrial inserts into agricultural housings. He salvaged eccentric collars, snap rings, and flanges no catalog could ship in time. He used old failed units as physical blueprints when computer systems insisted no substitute existed. In other words, he used knowledge where the market had only labels. Aaron saw more in those weeks than he had seen in the previous 10 years of working with his father-in-law. He saw Dale identify a usable outer geometry by feel before cleaning off the rust. He saw him glance at an old scorched bearing, mutter, "Gleaner clean grain, early 90s, and then prove himself right with calipers. He saw him build a functioning feeder house support assembly from 3 failed donor units and a retaining ring no one else would have thought to save. He saw him rescue a grain dryer fan motor setup by matching an industrial bearing hidden in a bin of wrong application, right dimensions. And most of all, he saw farmers who had once laughed at the wall now standing in line by the weld table holding worn-out components as if bringing offerings to a priest. One of those farmers was Curtis Hall. He came back a second time, less proud and more practical, carrying a box of dead bearings from his corn head and an expression that had lost some polish. "Figured you might want these," he said. Dale took the box and looked in. "Now you believe in leftovers?" Curtis managed half a smile. "Now I believe in not throwing away what I don't understand." That was as close to repentance as farm country usually gets. By the second week of harvest, the shortage was no longer rumor. Dealers across 3 counties were rationing some common units. Parts men spoke in lowered voices. Service trucks started carrying removed bearings back instead of pitching them in scrap because "maybe Dale can do something with them" had become part of the regional vocabulary. The big operations, which had always assumed money solved time, were discovering that money without parts is just louder waiting. Smaller operators, who had more practice making old things live, adapted faster. But even they found themselves leaning on Dale's shop when multiple breakdowns stacked up. The most dramatic case involved a custom harvesting crew running 3 combines and 2 grain carts on acres spread across county lines. In one brutal 48-hour stretch they lost a clean grain elevator bearing, a corn head idler, and 2 cart hub assemblies. One could perhaps be sourced. The rest could not. The crew owner, Sam Barrick, arrived at Dale's place at dawn with a pickup bed full of failed parts and the sort of face a man wears when entire crews are waiting on his next sentence. Dale walked the bed, moved pieces aside, and said, "You boys been farming with grease guns or prayer?" Sam said, "Mostly speed." Dale nodded. "That tracks." For 12 hours the shop became a rotation ward. Aaron cleaned housings. Dale measured bores. An apprentice pressed out salvageable races. They built 2 functioning cart hubs from old inventory and new seals. They adapted a combine bearing using a cross-reference Dale had scribbled in a notebook 7 years earlier after noticing a near match between a forage harvester unit and an obsolete grain elevator support. They cut a spacer sleeve for the corn head idler and reused a collar everyone else would have tossed. By midnight Sam's convoy was back on the road, tired and running, which in harvest is nearly the same thing as grateful. The county began retelling Dale's history differently. He was no longer the shop owner with a wall of dead bearings. He was the man who had been preparing for a problem everyone else was too modern to imagine. The dealership service manager who once mocked him started sending customers quietly his way for temporary solutions. Temporary in this case often meant good enough to finish harvest and maybe 3 more seasons if maintained honestly, which is one reason official systems dislike old repairmen. They expose how often new parts are sold as moral necessities rather than mechanical ones. At the co-op, the coffee talk changed. Men who had joked about junk now swapped stories about which impossible bearing Dale had found a way around. A local banker heard one of those stories and asked why so many operators were suddenly depending on a one-bay shop outside Oak Grove. Russ Talbert, who managed a grain location and understood machinery better than most bankers, answered, "Because he doesn't confuse a part number with a law of physics." That sentence traveled almost as fast as the shortages had. Dale himself remained unchanged by the county's improved opinion. He still came in before light, still sorted takeoffs by failure type, still scolded Aaron for putting adapter collars in the wrong bin, still wrote dimensions in a pencil hand so tight no one younger liked reading it. Respect did not soften him. It simply made interruptions more frequent. One evening in the middle of bean harvest, after helping 3 farms in a row, Aaron asked him why he had started saving bearings in the first place. Not the public answer. The real one. Dale sat on a stool by the wall and looked at the rows of labeled crates. For once he answered slowly. "First year I ran custom," he said, "I lost 3 days over one little unloading auger bearing. Had acres ready, weather right, trucks lined up, and one stupid part no bigger than a fist kept the whole machine from moving grain. Dealer couldn't get it. Warehouse said maybe Tuesday. Farmer I was cutting for sat on his tailgate and watched me miss his beans while that machine waited. Told myself if I ever got clear of that year, I wasn't going to let small metal own big days again." Aaron nodded. Dale kept looking at the wall. "Most breakdowns ain't dramatic. They're specific. That's what kills you. Not the size. The specificity. That was the secret the county had missed all along. People laugh at hoarded-looking knowledge because it lacks polish. But harvest is decided by specificity. The exact width of a race. The exact locking style. The exact offset of a flange. The exact collar, spacer, shoulder, snap ring, or bore that makes one spinning system different from another. Dale's wall was not thrift for thrift's sake. It was a library of specifics. By the time the combines finished, nobody in Jackson County was throwing away bearings casually anymore. Curtis Hall brought over 2 5-gallon buckets full of takeoffs and said, almost formally, "Figured these belong with someone who knows the difference." Sam Barrick paid his bill and added another $100 Dale hadn't asked for. The dealership service manager sent a young tech to spend 2 Saturdays in the shop learning some dimension logic, which was the most respectful phrase the man could produce without admitting prior ignorance. Aaron built a better catalog shelf. Dale let him, which in family terms counted as celebration. Winter brought relief to supply chains, at least partly. Inventories improved. Dealers caught up. New units reappeared. The crisis passed the way crises always do in agriculture, not cleanly, not all at once, but enough that people could begin pretending they had seen it coming. Yet the county did not quite return to its old arrogance. Too many acres had been saved by the exact habit they had mocked. Too many machines had run because Dale Cormick had spent 12 years accepting other people's discarded failures and turning them into stored knowledge. The following summer, at a machinery breakfast put on by a local dealer trying to rebuild goodwill, one of the presenters made a casual joke about farmers who keep dead parts too long. The room did not laugh the way it would have 3 years earlier. Someone in the back said, "Depends whose shop they're in." The presenter moved on quickly. That is how local reputations harden, not through applause, but through the sudden caution people use when naming what they once dismissed. Aaron changed most of all. He stopped seeing the wall as clutter and began seeing it as a method. He learned to tag failures by salvage path, not just by application. He built spreadsheets, which Dale distrusted but tolerated because Aaron also kept the physical logic intact. Together they created a cross-reference binder that married old handwritten notes to newer industrial catalogs. They separated truly destroyed bearings from ones carrying reusable geometry. They built a small press station dedicated to disassembly and inspection. And when local high school shop kids came through on tours, Aaron made sure they understood what the wall actually was. "It's not a pile of old bearings," he told them. "It's 12 years of not wasting evidence." That line would have pleased Dale if he had enjoyed praise more than accuracy. As it was, he just corrected Aaron's terminology on 2 locking collars and went back to work. Years later, when the worst of the shortage had become county legend, people still told the story in a simpler way. They said Dale saved dead bearings and then brought machines back when nobody else could. That was true, but only partly true. The deeper truth was better. He had spent 12 years refusing the lazy idea that once a part is worn, all its value vanishes at once. He understood gradations of failure. He respected dimensions more than labels. He trusted physical evidence over inventory screens. And when harvest started in a season that turned global disruption into local paralysis, that knowledge became more valuable than any shiny promise in a dealership showroom. They dumped worn bearings in his shop for 12 years. Then harvest started and nobody could buy new ones. And all at once, the county learned that what looks like clutter in peacetime can become the difference between stillness and motion when the season begins to close.